Welcome to Blackwater Media's Juneteenth Anthology celebration. You may ask yourself, what is this all about? Juneteenth is the celebration that commemorates the liberation from bondage those sons and daughters of Africa held as slaves in the United States and had existed as such in the Americas since the year 1619. And although President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the matter had not fully concluded until June 19, 1865, with the announcement of General Order 3, proclaiming freedom for enslaved people in Texas, which was the last state of the Confederacy with institutional slavery. And so therefore join me now in an exploration of the supernatural and paranormal experiences of an enslaved people who dreamed and struggled for an existence beyond the shackles of animal servitude and to breathe in the still rarefied air of freedom. There's an old slave shack out in the backside of Hollis Field. Before the Civil War, that whole area was Hollis Plantation. Hundreds of acres, mostly cotton, tobacco, and rice. By 1860, Winston Hollis owned a plantation with more than 100 slaves. It's all gone now, of course. The big house, the stables, the outbuildings. Everything except that lone shack, the single remnant of a failed cause and a bygone era. Now, for years and years, the old folks out that way told stories about Mama Sarah. They say that she was a slave on the Hollis plantation, but more than that she was a witch. Now, by witch, I don't mean like what you might see in some movie, or the common image that you're familiar with at Halloween. No, by no means. I mean that Mama Sarah was a seer, a practitioner, and she observed the traditions and beliefs and all of the old ways that her grandmother had brought with her from West Africa. Almost everybody knew it at the time. There were even white people who were a little bit afraid of her. They would never admit it publicly, of course, but the nods and whispers, as they always do, reveal the truth without a single word being spoken. Now, Mama Sarah was always good for cures and potions. She had knowledge of everything growing in the woods: roots, berries, mushrooms, leaves, and things she would not speak of, and could offer remedies for everything from terrible nightmares to a feverish case of swamp fever. But Mama Sarah knew other things too, way beyond the reach of an acidity bag. Like I said, she had the wisdom of things long forgotten by a people who were stripped of their native languages, beliefs, customs, traditions, and history. And she understood and respected the reality and the power of her ancestors, their gods, and the nature of other spirits, both good and evil. Now, Mama Sarah had a daughter named Anna. One night, one of the Hollis sons, a reprobate and well-known good-for-nothing named Charles, cornered her as she attempted to fill a well bucket, pulled her into a nearby outbuilding, and raped her. Upon his departure, he issued the following warning to Anna. One word about this, and your pretty brown skin's gonna be food for the alligators and snapping turtles. By the next full moon, Charles Hollis was dead. He had taken on a raging fever, and his body convulsed violently from severe muscle spasms from head to toe. And his back was profusely marked with pinkish red pustules, all from which eventually oozed a foul-smelling dark fluid. Officially, publicly, the doctors concluded that the cause of death was an extremely virulent strain of swamp fever. Privately, however, the suspicion was that Mama Sarah had placed some kind of death hex on Charles Hollis. On the second night following Charles Hollis's burial, two men, James Torn and Eli Sorensen, kicked in the door of Mama Sarah's shack and dragged both her and Anna outside. The men dragged the two women across a field in the direction of the swamp. None of them were ever seen again. Not Mama Sarah, not Anna, nor their assailants. Some people said that the four of them must have accidentally wandered into a bog and drowned in quicksand. Still others imagined that they must have fallen victim to that big, hairy, man-like creature in the swamp that left huge footprints and people were just starting to refer to as the skunk ape. Fanciful tales of adventure, mystery, and intrigue, to be sure. But I can do you one better. The men killed the two women, after, of course, violating them in unspeakable ways, and then sank their bodies into the endless black waters. At the moment of their deaths, Mama Sarah and Anna became one, a powerful guardian spirit, a gigantic magical being that existed to protect and defend the honor and virtue of the ancestral bloodline. And the old gods had imbued this being with all elemental magical strength. Now, like I mentioned at the start of our story, Mama Sarah's shack is the only remaining structure out there. And if you stand close enough to the old barbed wire fence, you can hear the wind whistling through the warped boards and half-rotted roof beams. But if I were you, I'd do it in the daytime. Because if you go out there at night, especially in the deep part of summer, I can just about tell you what to expect. Inside the blackness of the shack, you'll see 3 sets of pale yellow eyes, and they'll most likely be darting all around in a futile attempt at escaping their rickety prison. And then you'll see a towering figure emerge from the thick night air, a 20-foot specter with long midnight black hair, fiery eyes, and the gnashing teeth of a raging lion. It emerges with each rising moon to ensure eternal captivity and torment of 3 souls. Charles Hollis, James Torn, and Eli Sorensen, permanent residents of Mama Sarah's old shack. And I can assure you that, unlike the slave, their suffering will never end. I wanted to pass along a story that was told to me by my uncle. He passed away a few years ago, and I think it's important that what he witnessed, what he experienced, should be shared with the world. But before that, I need to tell you up front, there are some very, very disturbing aspects to this story. So consider yourself warned. This story goes back to 1957. The year that Hurricane Audrey, one of the deadliest tropical cyclones in U.S. history, devastated the southwestern Louisiana coast. My uncle said that there were many folks down in the bayous that were killed, and the survivors went out trying to recover bodies. He and some others who had friends in that area participated in recovery efforts. He said that at some point, he broke off from his group, which he admitted wasn't a smart thing to do. But he came up to a big cypress, and about 25 feet up, he saw what looked to him to be a gigantic black wolf sitting on a branch, eating the body of a child. From the clothing remnants and the length of the hair, it looked to him like a little girl, maybe 10 years old. He said he reached for his rifle and shot the thing 3 times with .35 caliber Winchester shells. He said you could see the impact as each thud caused water to spray off the thing's body. After the 3rd shot, it looked dead at him with pale yellow eyes, full in the face, and growled. And then it went right back to eating, now licking its lips with slurping and sucking sounds, making the sight even more gruesome. He said he hauled ass out of there, and he was haunted by the thought of creatures like that foraging the storm-struck bayou for the flesh of a dead person to feast on. But somehow he found the courage to go back the next day. He said that the thing had taken one of the child's thigh bones and jammed it hard into the base of the tree and hung the torso, stripped clean of flesh, and the child's head, which was untouched so he could clearly see her face, all hung there for him to find, made it very clear that these were cold-hearted, evil calculating monsters, not just animals. That was in 1957. My uncle had been holding this inside of him for 50 years, until he told it to me in 2007. A story about the aftermath of a natural disaster, and the story of a monster. Back in 1880, a former slave from a Georgia plantation called Old Sam, his name's been lost to history. It was said that he was starting to do okay for himself. He'd been working about 30 acres of his own for a few years and was looking to buy 10 more. But this was post-Reconstruction era Georgia, and Jim Crow was the social and political reality. Old Sam was falsely accused of stealing chickens and tobacco seed, and worst of all, of talking to a white woman while looking her in the eye. A few nights later, 5 men in robes and burlap hoods kicked in his door and pulled him from his bed at gunpoint. He was whipped on a post, beaten, and kicked to near unconsciousness. It took 5 men to do this. They bound his hands and feet, doused him with lamp oil, and then burned him alive in a hayloft. That was more than 100 years ago. But the ground could not hold his despair and anguish. It could not contain his stolen humanity. And so Old Sam returned just a few weeks later to pay a call to 5 men. Not in vengeance, but to collect a debt and in exacting justice. His ancestors and their gods have very, very long memories. You know how they say some folks are lucky at cards and some are lucky at love? Well, that fit Bobby Hansen to a T. He was the best poker player in the county, but somehow he couldn't find himself a bride. Oh, he proposed to several girls and even got accepted by a few, but they always got cold feet a day or two before the wedding. and it was bye-bye Bobby. After the third time, Bobby was mighty discouraged, and his pa felt real sorry for him. They were working together in the family grocery store, and Bobby would sometimes sit on top of the pickle barrel and tell his pa all his woes. And his pa told him to hang in there, because a nice lady was on her way. Neither of them believed it, but it made both of them feel better to hear it said. Well, the day after their latest talk, the old woman who poled her barge through the swamp to deliver milk and eggs to the grocery store had a long talk with Bobby's pa. Seemed she had this daughter who was hankering after a husband with a steady job, and the old man thought Bobby would do the job nicely. She suggested they introduce the pair at the next dance, and Bobby's pa agreed. The night of the dance, Bobby's pa insisted that his son dress in his best. Bobby was dragging his feet a little, remembering all those women who played him false and not wanting to go. But his pa dragged him out anyway. Well, the moment Bobby clapped his eyes on the dark-eyed girl from the swamp, he was head over heels in love. Her eyes sparkled like the sunlight on the bay. Her skin was as creamy as new milk. Her voice was low and sweet. The pair cuddled and cooed and waltzed the whole night long, and come sunrise, Bobby was all for bringing his new love before the visiting priest who delivered his sermons in the grocery store, since there was no church in that vicinity, and getting married right away. Well, the girl was willing to get married, but not by a priest. "Let's just go to the Beaumont and have the judge marry us," she said to Bobby, and he was so smitten he agreed, though it would have been quicker and easier to just walk a mile down the road to see the priest. By the next evening they were wed, and Bobby brought his pretty bride to the nice little cottage he rented just down the road from the family grocery. It had a nice front porch with a swing, a big bedroom on the second floor, and a big attic with a window that could be made up into a second guest room, should his new mother-in-law care to visit from her home in the swamp. After fixing him a nice dinner, Bobby's new bride sat a while in the rocking chair near their bed while Bobby yawned and watched her fondly. She cuddled under the blanket and knitted and hummed, and Bobby's eyes grew heavy. He didn't wake up until early morning, when his new bride crept into bed all hot and sweaty and fell asleep at once. When he asked where she'd been, she wouldn't answer him. Bobby was mighty sure that his bride had snuck out on him on their first wedding night. But when she got snappish and her eyes blazed like they did when he questioned her, he grew frightened and backed down. Life took on an odd pattern for Bobby. During the day, everything was perfect. His wife was sweet and pretty and loving. She kept the house sparkling clean and cooked him wonderful meals. But each night she refused to come to bed after supper. Like their wedding night, she sat up singing and rocking and knitting until he was asleep, and did not come to bed till just before dawn. She was always sweaty and cranky when she came to bed, and went to sleep before Bobby could question her. Bobby was very confused and upset by this behavior, and finally confided in his pa one morning after opening up the grocery store. Bobby's pa was awfully worried. The visiting priest had gone on to his next parish, and there was no one they could consult but the local conjure woman. So he sent Bobby to her with a couple of chickens as a gift. The conjure woman knew all about the hoodoo magic and was an excellent herbalist. Local folks went to her when they were sick, on account of the doctor lived almost 20 miles away. When she heard Bobby's story, she told him to pretend to go to sleep that night and watch what his new bride did. Then he was to come back and tell her everything. Bobby agreed. The next evening, he pretended to fall asleep while his bride rocked and sang in her chair. Then he followed her up to the attic and watched through the crack in the open door as she sat down at the spinning wheel and spun off her skin, leaving only pulsing red muscles and blue veins. She was a terrifying sight, and she sprang through the window and flew away into the night. Bobby ran out to the privy and was sick after he saw her. Who was this monster that he was married to? He was still trembling and in shock when his bride, looking like a normal person again, crept into bed at dawn, and he had trouble behaving normally at breakfast. As soon as he could get away, Bobby ran to the home of the conjure woman and told her about the spinning wheel and the terrible skinless creature who flew away from his attic. "A boo-hag," the conjure woman said at once. "You've married a boo-hag." "What's a boo-hag?" asked Bobby. "A boo-hag is a witch and a shapeshifter," said the conjure woman. "She lures men into her trap and then delivers them to her boo-daddy, who eats their flesh and gnaws their bones. And that's what she'll do to you if you don't get rid of her first." The conjure woman told Bobby to get himself some blue paint. As soon as the boo-hag left the house that night, he was to spread the blue paint on every window frame and every door frame and make sure it was 2 coats thick. A boo-hag couldn't fly through a window or door that was painted blue. And if she didn't get back into her skin before dawn, she would be trapped without it and be revealed for the monster she was. So he was to leave one tiny window unpainted and keep it open a sliver so the boo-hag could squeeze through. Then he was to fill up her skin with salt and pepper, which would burn her up from the inside out. And Bobby promised to do exactly as the conjure woman said. That night Bobby lingered over his dinner, looking with sad eyes at the pretty woman sitting opposite him. He knew she was really a monster inside, but it was so nice to have a little wife in his home. He hated like anything to see her go, but he didn't want to get eaten by a boo-daddy, and that was his fate if she stayed. So he went up to their bedroom and pretended to fall asleep while she rocked and sang and knitted. Then he followed her quietly upstairs and put salt and pepper into her skin after her ugly red-muscled blue-veined figure had flown out the window to her boo-daddy. He spent the rest of the night painting over every door and window frame with blue paint, leaving only one small unpainted window open in the cellar. He nailed it up so that it would be open no further than a crack, just as the conjure woman had instructed him. Then he hid himself behind a large chest of drawers up in the attic to wait for the boo-hag. Just before dawn, the boo-hag came flying up to the attic window. As soon as she touched the blue frame, she gave a shriek of pain and rage. Bobby listened as she flew around the house, testing each window and door and howling like a banshee when it burned her skinless hands. Then she found the little window in the cellar, and he heard the thump as she landed beside it, followed by a painful whimpering sound as she squeezed and squeezed herself through the narrow opening, her skinless red muscles and blue veins tearing painfully against the rough wood. The boo-hag ran up 3 flights of stairs into the attic and squeezed into her skin as fast as she could. She just barely got it on when the first light of dawn shone over the horizon. And that was when the salt and pepper did their work, burning the boo-hag's body from the inside out. With a scream of agony, she flung herself out the attic window. The glass shattered everywhere as she tried to fly away, tearing at the skin to get it off. But it was too late. She exploded into tiny pieces right over the swamp, and the alligators had them a mighty feast of cooked boo-hag for breakfast that morning. So Bobby was once again without a wife, but bachelorhood looked much better to him after that, and he never went looking for a wife again. Of course, after he made a pile of money and oil, the girl started chasing him. But that's another story. Good evening. It's a pleasure to have you all join me once again. I hope that each of you somehow, some way are able to make yourselves comfortable, but I doubt if that's a real possibility, especially when you learn what's in store for you. Tonight, we visit the continent of Africa, birthplace of civilization and of mankind itself. It is a place steeped in legend, lore, and myth. These, of course, occasionally intersect with the darkest nightmares imaginable. Our tale tonight is one such example. I offer you now the Vampire of Kari Hall, who, by the way, has recently taken up residence on the Nightfall radio show. Kari Hall in Shindam, Nigeria had been owned by a family named Sonsoro for well over 100 years. But at the end of the last century, they moved out to a larger estate in Zungeru and rented the house out to two brothers, Rano and Tarka Azari, and their sister Dia. The threesome settled comfortably into the house and soon made many friends in the surrounding area. One hot day in the middle of July, the sultry air made any kind of work impossible, so the three had an early supper. Afterward, they had all sat out on the porch, relaxing in the cooler air, and watched the beautiful full moon rise and wash the lawn in silver light. After a few hours, they grew tired and went indoors, each to their separate rooms. Dia found the night still too warm to sleep. She rose and opened her shutters, returned to the bed, mounted her pillows behind her, and sat up in bed, watching the moon through her ground floor window. After a time, she began to feel herself drifting off when she became aware of two tiny lights that seemed to flicker in and out of the row of trees that separated Kari Hall's lawn from the village mosque yard beyond. At first, they seemed little more than fireflies, but as Dia continued to stare at them, they drew nearer. She saw to her surprise that they appeared to be enclosed in a dark mass of shadow, which had somehow broken away from the moon-cast shadows beneath the trees. Dia's hand went to her throat as she realized that something was approaching the house, and growing larger the nearer it came. She noticed that every few moments the dark mass was engulfed by the shadows of trees on the lawn, but then the mass always re-emerged, larger than the previous moment, and always coming closer and closer. Closer. Dia became filled with horror and felt as though she would cry out, but her throat felt paralyzed. Then she realized that any noise that she might make would almost certainly draw the attention of the thing outside. Then she realized something else. Whatever was out there would surely not be stopped by a barrier of glass panes and thin wooden sashes. Then suddenly the mysterious shape turned aside as if it were going around the other side of the house. As soon as Dia determined that the menacing figure was out of sight, she leaped from her bed and ran to the hall door. But when her fingers grasped the cool brass knob, she heard a blood-chilling scratch at the window. When she turned, she beheld a hideous pale face with burning red eyes glaring back at her. The creature began rattling the windows, which were locked from the inside. For a hopeful instant, and only that long, Dia believed that the doors might actually keep the thing at bay. But as the rattling grew into a more fervent attempt at entry, Dia resigned to the fact that escape might be a more viable alternative. She tried to open the bedroom door to flee out into the hall beyond, but the antique handle jammed, leaving her trapped in the room. The creature outside began scratching on the glass, pecking its talon-like nails on the frail panes. Then it started ripping away the lead frames which held the glass in place. Dia tried to scream, but fear would only allow a pitiful moan to escape from her lips. Then, one single diamond-shaped pane fell inward and shattered on the floor. An incredibly long, spiny finger slunk through and found the latch on the window and threw it open. Now possessed only by the most potent horror, Dia jumped from the bed to which she had retreated upon discovering the jammed door. She hoped to reach the closet, but her resolve was too little, too late. The thing exploded into the room, grabbed her by the hair with its bony fingers, and flung her down onto the bed in such a way that her head hung over the side. Then, in a moment of savage cunning, evil, and terror, the thing bit her on the throat. The stinging pain released her voice, and she at last began to scream. As she fought and struggled to push the monstrous form away from her, she could hear her brothers shouting and pounding on the door. When Rano and Tarka saw that the door would not budge, they slammed themselves against it, throwing it down by sheer force. Inside, they found their sister bleeding from the wound in her throat and unconscious. They looked outside past the open window and saw nothing. Suddenly, Rano shouted, "I see him!" He pointed to the tall figure that fled from the shadows under the large Iroko. Without hesitation, he pursued it, but the creature moved incredibly fast, with long, loping strides, and leaped over the wall into the mosque yard. By the time Rano had reached the fieldstone wall, he saw nothing save the gravestones and vaults. The thing, whatever it was, had vanished into the night. Frustrated and angry, he returned to his sister's room. There he discovered that Dia had regained consciousness, while Tarka applied a damp towel to her throat wound. "We'll keep watch the rest of the night," said Tarka. "In the morning, we'll take the first train back to Ado Ikiti." "Rano!" Dia shouted. "Did you find out who or what attacked me?" "No," Rano confessed. "It escaped into the mosque yard. But whatever it was, Tarka is right. We must leave here as quickly as possible." But Dia began shaking her head. "I won't let this drive us from our house in which we've been so happy." Rano and Tarka tried to persuade her to leave, but still she refused. "We've leased this house for 5 years," she said, "and we've been here less than 1. We can't afford to move elsewhere while paying rent on this place." Her brothers reluctantly agreed, and next morning the local constable helped them decide when he suggested it must have been a lunatic escaped from some asylum. Then he added with great authority, "He's not likely to return." So they stayed at Kari Hall, but Rano and Dia switched rooms. Dia kept her shutters closed fast at night. Both Rano and Tarka kept loaded pistols nearby. Winter came and went without incident. One night, sometime around the middle of March, Dia was suddenly awakened by a dreadful scratching at her shutters. When she looked up, she saw the same gruesome, pale, shriveled face staring back at her. She screamed as loud as she could, and her brothers dashed out of the house with their pistols drawn. Tarka spotted the creature loping across the lawn and fired. The lead ball lodged firmly into the thing's left leg, and the force of the impact sent the monster sprawling, but it quickly recovered and scrambled over the graveyard wall. But this time, Rano and Tarka reached the wall in time to see the dark figure disappear into a neglected vault. The next day, in the company of the constable and several other local authorities, the vault was opened. Inside, they discovered that all of the coffins had been smashed and their contents strewn across the floor. Only one coffin lay intact, though its lid was loose. At the constable's instruction, Rano and Tarka raised the coffin lid. Dia gasped, for lying inside was the pale and withered figure that had twice appeared and attacked her at the hall. Then further investigation revealed that the left leg of the body had been damaged by a pistol shot. Now it is a fact that no one uttered the dreaded word vampire, though all knew full well that such was among them, and by common agreement they did the only thing that could permanently banish the evil that haunted them. They burned the body to ashes. After that, there were no more disturbances at Kari Hall. The Freedom Riders were civil rights activists who rode interstate buses in segregated southern states to challenge the non-enforcement of the Supreme Court rulings that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. In short, southern states ignored the court decisions in order to maintain segregation. My name is Richard, and I'm proud to have been among the hundreds of young people to participate in that effort. On December 10th, 1961, we left the Atlanta Terminal Station on a Trailways bus bound for Albany, 183 miles to the south. Now, trust me, there wasn't a lot to see on those long stretches of Georgia highway once we were out of Atlanta. But the bus was filled with laughter, conversation, and transistor radios radiating the sounds of Ray Charles and Jackie Wilson. Anyway, we stopped in Cordele, which was only a small smattering of buildings, houses, and farms along the highway. So by stopped, I mean the bus pulled into an abandoned lot, mostly overgrown with weeds, and the lot looked to have been a gas station at some point. It was a good opportunity for everyone to stretch their legs, enjoy sandwiches, coffee, Coca-Cola, and cigarettes. 15 minutes later, the bus driver, a guy named Mike came barreling around the corner yelling for everyone to get back on the bus. My first thought was like, shit, did the Klan show up out here? Because I knew for a fact that there were some brothers out here packing some firepower under their jackets. But there was just a brief moment of confusion. And again, Mike, the driver, reiterated in a much louder voice, "Get on the goddamn bus." And that was it. Everybody loaded onto the bus, still eating, sipping coffee, and smoking. Strangely, there wasn't too much made about why we had to get back on so fast, and it didn't take long for all the music and laughter to kick back up again. I can say this now because so many years have gone by. But a few miles down the road, Mike, our driver, took a fairly deep swig from his flask, and we kept rolling. When we pulled into Albany, I went up to ask him about what shook him up so much. He just looked at me, hesitated for a moment, and said, "A damn huge-ass wolf ran across the road." And I was like, "What? Man, there aren't that many wolves in Georgia, and aren't they mostly up in the mountains anyway?" He said, No, you don't understand. This motherfucker was running on 2 legs, and it had to be 7 or 8 feet tall. Of course, like I said, that was a long time ago. I know now that what he saw was the thing people call Dog Man. Man, there's some crazy shit in this world. And based on what Mike said he saw, I'm glad it was him and not me. Good evening. I'm sincerely honored that you've joined me tonight, especially given the fact that you've done so at your own peril. As you're no doubt aware, I'm the curator of this gallery of ghouls, this hall of horrors. Case in point, a series of mysterious deaths in a quiet little New England hamlet, circa 1840. What lies in store for you tonight is the story of this little-known nightmare. Our tale is called Horror at Willow's End, which, just as a reminder, could only be told on the Nightfall radio show. How shall I begin my tale? For if great care is not taken in its telling, you'll no doubt think me a madman, though such a notion, when viewed through the kaleidoscope of the events which have thusly transpired, has at times been worthy of some consideration. My name is Washington, John Washington, having been named by my parents for the first 2 American presidents. Both of my parents, now long dead, had been slaves who escaped here to Maine from South Carolina some years before I was born. Initially, I knew nothing of slavery, its cruelty and brutality, save that which I had read in the newspaper accounts written by the correspondents who made regular visits to the port cities of Savannah and Charleston. I did know of the Freedmen's Bureau, composed of both free Negroes and good-hearted white men, who work here in Maine and in other free states lobbying the Congress to outlaw the slave trade altogether. In any event, I had come to take employment at Whitaker's Free Press, for I had been known among my circle of acquaintances as a wordsmith of sorts, and was therefore given naturally to such a vocation. My education had been a formal one, having been schooled at the Miriam Academy for Negro Boys, and then North Point Lowell, where I received diplomas in both areas of language and philosophy. The rapport established between myself and the owners of the press, Mr. T.R. Dunhill, was of genuine warmth and congeniality. He respected my abilities and potential. Similarly, I admired his obvious prosperity and accomplishment, as well as his fervent sensibilities regarding social consciousness and responsibility. I settled into my work with general ease and began establishing a reputation as an honorable, dependable, and industrious newspaperman. I took up residence in the city proper, a second-floor arrangement, 820 Hunter Street, with spare bed and an extra room into which I designed a study. It was a modest room, no more than 25 paces between the 4 walls, But the oaken bookcases, the red bricked fireplace, and marvelous iron-latched windows summoned in my mind images of long, quiet autumn evenings with a friendly pipe, brandy, a warm fire, and volumes of Cervantes, Aesop, Shakespeare, or Homer. It was in that study, in which I have long since come to find great comfort and security, that I read the courier message that was to change my life. When the knock came at my door, it wasn't terribly late, perhaps just after 9, but it did seem an odd hour for visitors. It was a young man with a uniform and cap reading Eastern Atlantic Courier in small white stitched letters. I took the message, attended to the boy's gratuity, and closed the door, bidding the youthful messenger a good night. Returning to the study, I sat in the chair by the fire, opened the letter, and began reading. 30th August 1840. Dear John, forgive the intrusion into the privacy of your home and leisure. I did, however, regard your diligence and long-standing commitment to your vocation and your honor, and was thus obliged to inform you concerning the following. I have received word from acquaintances living upstate about a series of mysterious deaths, the details of which are unspoken. Yet some element of the bizarre is implied throughout the correspondence. It is a small farming and dairy village called Willow's End. Truth be told, I knew nothing of that part of the state, and indeed the village itself is absent from our office maps. If it is agreeable, proceed to Willow's End post-haste with the intent of uncovering the mystery. And as your journey will be some hours, I have secured horse and hansom, reserved to depart at first light tomorrow. Once there, contact a Mr. Philip Wellington, village constable. As the village does not possess a telegraph office, I will await the conclusion of your investigation in its entirety. Regards and success, T. R. Dunhill, editor, Whitaker's Free Press. Upon reading the note, I must confess some degree of exhilaration, as if I were about to embark upon some unknowable yet grand escapade through which some discovery of merit could be attributed to me. And yet I was also set uneasy, for rumors of murder and of dark omens held for me a natural foreboding of dread. And yet curiosity compelled me to consider the contents of what was before me. I felt a chill overcome me, and it was as if the knowledge of what was to come had settled down upon me like the frigid pall of death. But I knew not what was to come. I felt as though I were walking through the original garden, with the serpent slithering, unseen, underfoot, harboring some secret parcel of terror to which I would succumb. And still, the allure, the dramatic pull of a foray into the unknown was such that I hastened out of the study, down the hall to withdraw clothing from the wardrobe in preparation for the long journey to a place of which I had never heard, and from which I might never return. As I journeyed through the countryside, I took careful account of the marvelous landscape which surrounded me. All around there were elms, aspens, and maples in their late summer attire, and also shrubbery, fruit, and flowering plants of every kind, fuchsia, plum, sassafras, pawpaws, and mignonette. A small brook ran briskly just off the road to the left of me. I could see the morning sun's reflection playing and glistening against large stones which lay prominently in the shallow creek bed. The water rushed and ran white against them, causing an eye-pleasing gem-like sparkle. In total, I embraced all of the wonders of nature, that their splendor might somehow, or in some unorthodox capacity, add to my constitution in preparation for some unseen destiny. Of Willow's End I knew nothing, save that I, like Mr. Dunhill, had been unable to locate it on my map, and the other relevant facts of the matter which had been explained to me in the letter. But I did know that a small, isolated, and virtually unknown farming village would be a breeding ground for superstition and all manner of talk about wild goings-on, of spirits, hobgoblins, and haints. Given that just such a place had already been the scene of a number of strange unexplained deaths, Whispers of supernatural influences, sorcerers, werewolves, and such had no doubt already taken a stronger than usual foothold and were on the increase exponentially. Nevertheless, I arrived there shortly before dusk, and I remember that in the miles preceding my destination, that the landscape had undergone a certain alteration, definite albeit subtle. The colors of the hedges and grass seemed less poignant. The sweetness of the summer blooms, which had formerly cascaded all around me, had been substituted with the unsettling hint of decaying wood, as if all the forest had fallen into some morbid vortex of dilapidation. Now, all of these things, mind you, were less obvious in that place and time than they may appear to you in my retelling of their happening. It was all in all a graduated effect, and unhindered my growing weariness of the journey. The coach stopped in front of a small wood-frame building with a sign suspended by a pair of short chains which read, "Constabulary, P. Wellington attending." The coachman assisted me to the door of the office with the larger of my 2 suitcases. As I pushed open the door, I was greeted by a large man whom I immediately took to be Constable Wellington. I saw in his expression an initial display of surprise at my being a Negro. This dissipated rapidly, indicating that he was perhaps a fair man, being a close and long-time associate of Mr. Dunhill. We shook hands and introduced ourselves, and he invited me to sit down. He offered me a drink, which I accepted gladly in hopes that it would diffuse my travel fatigue. He poured what I took to be brandy from an unlabeled bottle into a small glass. After he handed me the drink and poured himself one, he sat in a large cushioned chair behind his desk. He went on to describe to me with some reservation, I felt, that so far there had been 4 deaths. He told me that all of the bodies had been horribly mangled, as if they had been clawed and ripped, and then chewed or gnawed upon by some wild, indescribable beast. He said that basically each of the 4 bodies had been so thoroughly mauled that positive identification had only been possible through recognition by family members of the deceased's tattered clothing. And he told me more. Though their bodies were discovered in different locations, each was in some proximity to the Hampton Woods, which indeed lay directly on the northern outskirts of the village. I came to learn that many of the local folk bypass the Burgess Road by taking a trail, which carries them through Hampton and into the village. It was, in my judgment, knowledge of this shortcut, as it were, that led to the grisly demise of the 4 unfortunate persons of whom Constable Wellington had spoken. I asked the constable if it were possible to investigate the Hampton Woods. We might be able to find clues as to exactly what menace had befallen the 4 victims. Had it been a homicidal wayfarer seeking sport? A band of rogue highwaymen bent on mischief of the worst sort? Perhaps a wolf pack or a cougar had come down from the high country following the elk herds. Such things were known to have happened in the past. Having consented to my request, the constable and I set out for the Hampton Woods under the cover of night. I have often pondered many times since why we chose to do so. Why had we not gone under the protection of broad daylight? Why had we opted to venture out into the black wilderness when all of the sinister elements of creation held sway? We readied for our excursion, making all of the necessary arrangements and taking all necessary precautions. The night air was unusually chilled for that time of year, and there was a particular quality of dampness that hung like a cloak across the shoulder of the night. Constable commented on how unsettling that was to him. I silently concurred with his assessment as we entered into the Hampton Woods. Once in the woods, we saw that the fog lay incredibly thick, much more so than down in the village. All around us it swirled, blanketing us in an impenetrable white soup. Then we heard the sounds. At these sounds my blood ran cold, for they seemed to emanate from all around us as if we were surrounded by some kind of whispering horde of the damned. Like myself, the constable's eyes flashed wide with curiosity and fear. I told him that we should turn back to back, each man protecting the rear of the other in lieu of an eventual attack. The constable thought it to be a sound tactic, and as we turned our backs to one another, I saw Constable Wellington draw a pistol from his belt and assume a formidable pose. The sound was growing, all around, encircling us. Feral whispers rising into faint grunts and snarls. The constable, by all accounts a brave man, told me that no matter what might transpire, that we should give a good account of ourselves in the ensuing drama. Now the mist began to fall away, revealing masses of diminutive shadows huddled and revealed in the darkness against reflected moonlight. There were creatures all around us, scores of them. They were hideously twisted monstrosities, and an absolute terror to behold. Each one, though differing somewhat from the other, possessed horribly mottled gray skin which seemed coated with a moist film, giving the creatures an almost reptilian sheen. Their eyes, which were huge and abominable, were diamond-shaped, black and bottomless, as they no doubt contemplated unfathomable evil. The creatures bore mouths that were filled with row upon row of horrid, jagged, razor-like teeth, the edges of which oozed with rivulets of gruesome saliva. Their arms were raised in a terrifying manner, showing hands upon which were mounted furious black claws, which raked in the air and in our direction. The snarls which the beast hurled at us grew into growls, and then nightmarish wails. The attack was upon us. The constable fired into the bestial horde, which approached him furiously. Strangely, the bolt of the blast caused the things to recoil momentarily from their attack. Their brief retreat was also no doubt due in part to the reaction of having one among them hurled some yards back, and now lying dead on the ground, with a ball lodged in its gullet. Now the demeanor of the creatures took on a sense of wariness, as if they now knew that this enterprise involved an element of danger for them. Emboldened, I reached inside my cloak to the belt beneath my vest, which revealed a pistol which I had brought along unbeknownst to the constable, as our situation was untenable. He looked agreeable upon its appearance, and then I too fired into the now frenzied swarm, striking my chosen target. Constable Wellington began his onslaught, falling the grotesque ogres as they charged him. But alas, the sheer number of them was far more than our ammunition could hope to contain. As the attack continued, it became a contest of strength, of brute force, that of man versus monster. As they came on, we hurled large stones at them. Fallen branches were swung, bashing skulls, teeth, and ribs. And we used our bare hands, struggling against wicked claws and razor-sharp teeth. The world became a nightmarish whirl of evil and darkness. My mind and body were awash with the bestial contest now thrust upon me. My muscles ached with every motion. My bones rattled like so many tossed dice from the savage blows, scratches, gashes, and bites that I had taken thus far. But I held fast to the ground under my boots, for surely surrender meant certain death. And then, from somewhere in the surrounding darkness, a shot rang out, and in the midst of the great struggle, one of the creatures fell. Then another shot, and another, and another. The beasts had suddenly become the hunted. Some of the men from the village, determined that the horror should end that night, had come to our rescue, ending the long nightmare of Willow's End. That is my tale, an all too terrifying and harrowing account all those years ago. To this very day I cannot ascertain from where the creatures had originated. Some said that they were demonic entities, agents of the underworld, which had come to plague mankind. There were some, mostly Indians from nearby tribes, who were said to have claimed for generations that these were creatures that had roamed the isolated dark regions of the country for centuries in a sort of dormancy, and rising only occasionally and with dark intent. Such things had also been spoken of by runaway slaves. There were many among my people to whom the old traditions of Africa had been passed, and those traditions had not faded. There had been a man named Gerard, I think. Yes, that was it. His name was Johann Gerard, and he was known in those days to be a learned man, a scholar, a man of reason, science, and philosophy. I remember having spoken to him in the company of Constable Wellington, no less. He told me that for a number of years he had practiced the science of astronomy and had become most familiar with what lay in the heavens. I remember this event specifically because he told me that he had his own theory about where the dreadful beasts had come from. He said that one night in November, as he recalled, he had been gazing at the stars through his telescope, identifying the various constellations and planets that were in the power of his lenses to view. He said that something up there had caught his eye, something unusual that he had never seen before. He thought at first that it had been a comet or a meteor, but he watched the object hurtle earthward, burning green, then blue, and then yellowish orange. He tracked the object and watched as it crashed to earth in a plume of dust and smoke. When I asked about the location of the crash, I was plummeted into a state of horror at his response. The thing, he said, crashed in the Hampton Woods. The implication that these horrid monsters had hailed from the outer reaches of the cosmos filled me with dread. What other unspeakable nightmares might await us? We are but small creatures and must thusly tread with the greatest of care with all things. And so at long last I returned home to familiar surroundings, to Mr. Whitaker's office, where I hope this story will be published, and of course to my beloved 820 Hunter Street, oaken bookcases, warm pipe, brandy, and red-bricked fireplace. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. The master of the plantation was a firm supporter of the Confederate president and had committed to send as much food as he could to the Southern Army. Things were going well at first until the Yankees began attacking the master's supply lines. The master suspected a traitor among his slaves and soon discovered that the Yankee spy was a slave woman named Big Liz. She was a behemoth of a girl who could pick up 2 full-grown pigs, one under each arm, and cart them over to the slaughterhouse without assistance. If he confronted her directly and she fought back, she would have taken him to pieces. So the master came up with a different plan to rid himself of the spy. He approached the giant girl and asked her to assist him with a special task. He told her that President Jefferson Davis had entrusted him with a large chest full of gold. To keep it out of Yankee hands, he wanted to bury the chest where it would never be found. The girl's eyes gleamed when she heard of this false report. The master knew she was already planning to betray the existence of the chest to the Yankees. The master made Big Liz carry the heavy trunk several miles out into the swampland and asked her to dig a deep hole for the trunk. He sat at his leisure while she worked and strained for hours against the muddy ground, which kept oozing back into the hole. When the slave girl was completely exhausted, the master decreed the hole to be large enough for his war chest. Wearily, Big Liz dropped the shovel and pulled the heavy chest down until it lay at her feet. Then she started to climb out of the deep hole, but the master barred her way, and Big Liz gazed up at him in sudden fear as he loomed over her. "Traitor! Yankee spy!" the master hissed. "There's only one path open to a traitor." The master swung his sword at her, and the sharp edge of the blade cut clean through the slave girl's neck. Her head went rolling away into the tall grass as her body toppled across the chest. The master heaped dirt over the chest and the body of the slave girl who had betrayed him. Briefly, he considered finding her head and burying it in the pit with her body. But it was too dark to go wandering in the dangerous marshland, and he knew that scavengers would make short work of the head when they found it. As the master walked toward home through the dark swamp, he became aware of a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as if someone were watching him. The master walked faster as clouds obscured the light of the moon. The master's teeth chattered as a breeze cut through him like the sharpened blade of the sword at his side, and his straining ears picked up the sound of footsteps on the path behind him. The master was filled with a terrible superstitious dread of demons and witches and ghosts. He broke out in a panicked run, fleeing up the path as fast as his legs would carry him. To his relief, he saw the lights of his house rise before him and knew he was home. As he rounded the back corner of his house, he was confronted by a massive, dirt-encrusted figure that glowed with blue fire. The smell of rotting leaves and marsh grass filled his nostrils as his eyes raced up and up the tall creature until they rested on the stump of its neck, where a head had resided only an hour before. Then he heard a chuckle from the creature's side, and he saw the phantom's head tucked under her arm. The master stumbled backwards, gabbling desperately in fear as the ghost placed her head upon the ground with one hand and grabbed the collar of his shirt with the other. The murdered slave girl snapped the master's neck in two and dropped his dead body to the ground beneath his bedroom window. Then Big Liz gathered up her severed head and vanished into the darkness. They say that on the anniversary of her death, the ghost of Big Liz still may be seen roaming the swamplands near her old home. Anyone foolish enough to walk near her grave will be driven away by the phantom, which to this day still defends the place where the Confederate chest is buried.